I'm delighted, obviously, to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm national lead, UK lead for tackling violence against women and girls, and that's by accident as always. When you deal with a case, they think, oh, you must be good at it, let's carry on. But from my perspective, I'm looking at the program, I think I'm the only man speaking in the next 3 hours, and therefore I'm allowed to bash men, okay? Can I say this? Every single element of all the crimes that Carolina mentioned to you, I think there are more than 50 shades, actually, of violence against women. I think when it comes down to it, every single one is about men trying to control women's behaviour. These are all control crimes. These are all about men suggesting, because of through weakness or some distorted view of masculinity, that they can use violence and use violence whenever it suits them. And so we have this issue across every country. I was in Turkey earlier on this week, in Istanbul in fact, and the Turkish president mentioned a delightful story about her mother's heaven lies at the feet of a mother, which is absolutely right. But I said, and said to him, many mothers are running using their feet from the abuser that's chasing after them. And I think one needs to put it in context. That's what we're up against. We're up against men who simply cannot cope with losing power and men exerting their power. We're talking about women and girls who are brought up very often to think that men are the answer to their problems, when in fact men aren't even one of the questions. We're talking about men who simply say, you have to obey me, you have to, your example earlier on, that you have to obey me, and if you don't obey me, there are consequences to what you do. So every single one of these, whatever the area of criminality we're talking about, is all about male power and male control. And it's about man's obsession. I'm ashamed of the man's obsession with the Great Wall of Vagina. It's somehow that they think they need to control everything that a woman has to do, all the choices that she wants to make, all the choices she should be allowed to make. And the reality is, that's when we come up. I mean, I came across this issue of honor-based violence 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when victims and survivors started telling me this is a big issue for them, and that no men were talking about this subject. They informed me, they educated me. As a result, I began dealing with it. And the US State Department very recently said that I have prosecuted more honor killings than anybody in the world. And that, to my mind, is a shameful statistic. But the reality is, we cannot allow people to get away with it. And let me give you some examples of the things that we have to deal with. Yes, we have to deal with prevention. I'll touch on that in a minute. We have to deal with protection, and some of the things we've touched on earlier around the support you offer victims and witnesses. We have to prosecute. It's a sledgehammer that you have to use now and again to demonstrate to people that what they are doing is wrong. Yes, it's morally wrong, it's legally wrong, but there's also a business case for this. We learned 30-odd years ago that billions and billions of euros are spent because of the attitude of men in terms of domestic abuse and domestic violence. All these women who can't contribute because they're in healthcare or because they can't work or because they've been abused. There's a strong business case for tackling this issue, and many governments are beginning to listen because of that strong business case. Now, I'm absolutely determined, as you probably heard, that we are talking here about gender terrorism. I often use that phrase and people are frightened of it. You know, America had their terror on 9/11, Britain has had terror many times, but on 7/7, women, millions of women, are experiencing terror 24/7, 365. And that's what we're up against, women who are constantly being picked on. Some of the cases I've dealt with, Lorraine, it's evident to me that the family have used the most brutal violence against the woman, not just for her, but for every other woman. So they can see this is the consequence that will follow if you misbehave in some way or you make a choice that others won't agree with. We have to challenge the view of masculinity that male power involves violence. We have to make sure, and it's absolutely pitiful, the number of crimes that we prosecute, the number of people that report, because that's not their failure, that's our failure as justice organisations and as a state. Women have suffered enough without being let down by the state. We've got to make it as easy as possible for people to feel comfortable about coming forward and make the court process as simple as it possibly can be, so long as, obviously, evidence is tested, in order for that witness to be able to give the evidence of the abuse that they've suffered. You know, and I know, talking about the most intimate things that's happened to you is difficult. Never mind talking to strangers in a jury or whatever court process you may have. And we've got to make that as simple and easy as possible. I know that there is no community. Yes, I've dealt with grooming involving Pakistani men, I've dealt with white men, I've dealt with 64 countries. I've looked it up the other day. I have prosecuted men from 64 countries in England. I have prosecuted victims from 45 different countries. There is no community where you are not at risk of violence against women. There's no community, absolutely none. And I think that anybody that tries to bring it down to an ethnic issue or whatever it is, yes, there is an issue about some cultures and some people within certain cultures that think that they can get away with this kind of thing. The reality is, it's got nothing to do with culture. I am culturally blind, ethnically blind, religiously blind. I look at the crime, I look at the behaviour. If it's wrong, it must be prosecuted. That must be how we approach it. Otherwise, people will assume that we will tolerate abuse because of culture or tradition. Let me make this abundantly clear. I flew in this morning with 150 children going to Disneyland. And they reminded me of Disney. They reminded me of tradition. Traditions are man-made. And you know what the story of Sleeping Beauty? How she was poisoned by the wicked witch, and then she awoke when she was kissed by the handsome prince. Remember that one? No. The earliest version of that story, Sleeping Beauty, the young girl in question was raped in a forest, by a man obviously, raped by a man. She went into catatonic shock. She only awoke 9 months later by giving birth to the twins conceived of that rape. Disney didn't like that version, for some reason. But see what man has done. Man has turned a story in which women are the victims and man is the bad guy to a story that you all now know to be a case where, actually, hang on a minute, the wicked witch, a woman was a bad guy, and a handsome prince, a man was a good guy. See, this is what men do. They convert, they revert, they turn things around to suit their case, to suit their arguments. You've got to recognize it. Tradition is made by man, culture is made by man. I dealt with a case a few years ago where this woman, Candice Ria, her name was, her house was burnt down, her and her 4 children were killed. The evidence was extremely strong against the ex-husband. He didn't like the fact that she wanted a divorce, and he didn't like the fact that she wanted her own choices. But despite the overwhelming evidence and the fact that he was convicted, there are still people in that community who think that her house was haunted. There are still people who would rather believe it was a ghost than a man that could kill those 5 people. So get what we're up against. We are up against a scenario where men will try and justify each other's behaviours, where men will try and demonstrate that women in some way are at fault. And our silence will lead to tolerance regardless of what community. 3 years ago, I dealt with that case that Lorraine mentioned, the Rochdale grooming gang, which was a group of Asian men that were abusing 47 girls. They were moving them around, prostituting them, etc. Young girls, as young as 11, 12. And several years ago, 5 years ago, in fact, 6 years ago, nobody wanted to prosecute them, no police officer wanted to investigate it properly. I came into the northwest of England, re-looked at that case, prosecuted them, and they were convicted. The point being, if we didn't believe them, nobody else would. And we would be consigning them to a lifetime of abuse if we didn't act upon their abuse. And that's the kind of courage, not my courage, their courage in giving evidence, their courage in being supported, and their courage in enabling those prosecutions. And the abuse I got was not from by the way, I'm not on Twitter anymore, don't follow me. The abuse I got was not from the Muslim community, the Asian community, it was from the far right, because they did not like, their narrative is very simple, ladies and gentlemen, that all minorities are the same. They did not like the fact that a minority brought these people to justice. And the abuse I got was tellingly thousands of letters and emails being sent to President Obama, the Prime Minister, calling for me to be sacked and deported. I was born in Birmingham, England, and I don't want to go back there. My point is, I don't care if somebody throws abuse at me for what I do. If I get it right, then that's what they do to you when you get it right. I don't care about it ultimately. If you're being attacked from both sides, you're probably in the right place, my view is. In terms of issues of honour, yes, I recognise that. I ran into a father a few years ago who said to me, Nazir, you don't understand, he said, my son has been sent to jail for dealing crack cocaine. 6 years he got. My daughter, she wants to choose her own partner. What shame she's bringing to my family. See, one rule for men, another for women. And forced marriage, we barely touched on that. There are at least 10,000 forced marriages or threats of marriage every year in the UK. Never mind anywhere else in the world. We've now criminalised it this year for the first time ever. We've got that issue to deal with. And forced marriage is not just about threats and duress and all that sort of stuff. Forced marriage is, emotional blackmail. A mother or a parent knows what buttons to press in a child. And if you run away, the next thing you hear is your mum has had a heart attack. You come back because your mum's had a heart attack. Forced marriage is one of the best cures for heart disease I've ever heard. And then they're giving you show a picture of your groom, he looks like David Beckham, and you end up marrying somebody who's like me. It's just more handsome. Now, so my point is that the deception, there's so many different elements, and we don't even appreciate learning difficulties. One girl we went across was 24 years old. She'd been married forcibly 4 times at 24. She had such significant learning difficulties, she didn't even understand what a marriage was. She was being used by her family to facilitate immigration. £10,000 every time. That's what we're up against. LGBT issues, the moment you come out as gay, you're going to get married tomorrow. That's your partner, you're going to get married. They have to save face. They think they have to save face. You know, they have to somehow suggest to the rest of the community everything is hunky-dory, everything is fine. You've got to recognise that as not an issue. When I dealt with a case recently called, the defendant's name was Asha, this 9-year-old girl who had significant learning difficulties, who couldn't hear, she was mute, didn't have any sense of language, arrived in England with a passport that said she was 19 and she was just waved through. For 10 years she was in the cellar of a house in the north of England where she was being sexually abused by the older member of the family and she was being used as forced labour. It took me 6 months to try that case because we had to teach her sign language first. Right? And once we'd done that, and after convicting the family and putting him in jail, then I went after his assets. We've got his house, we've sold his house, that's £100,000 compensation for her. Because we want to make sure that she is compensated, that she's repaid in some small way. And I met her very recently again. She's one of the most confident women I know. That's what you can do. You can turn abuse into something. She shouldn't have had to be abused. There are failings of so many communities and so many, regrettably, so many authorities and associations that allow that to happen and continue to allow it to happen. But we've got to do this together. This is a multi-agency approach. Every one of us has to raise awareness, as Lorraine has indicated. This can't be done just by justice or by police officers or prosecutors. Everybody has to play their part. Specialist courts, specialist prosecutors, specialist police officers. All of that is absolutely necessary. Awareness across the board, in recognising that good role models are in place, equal treatment, equal support for everybody, better support, bespoke support for some of our victims in the way I indicated. Domestic violence has to be recognised as beyond the violence, the psychological, the financial abuse. I dealt with a case recently where she had told me that he had been prosecuted and successfully prosecuted and fined, and then she had been told by him to pay her fine. That's financial abuse, and we prosecute him for that too. You get my point is, you've got to look beyond what everybody else is doing. You've got to make sure that your silence does not allow this kind of thing. And Lorraine's absolutely right. When you have a situation or communities where boys are seen as a blessing and girls are seen as a burden, that's where where it all starts. Then you have feticide, then you have infanticide, then you have child marriage and early marriage, then you have all the domestic abuse and familial issues. And forced marriage, by the way, is not the end of someone's suffering, it's the beginning of someone's suffering. They will have, it's like an earthquake, followed by a tsunami of domestic abuse, followed by child protection issues, suicide and murder. You know, that's what we're up against. We're up against people who ultimately do not care about the hopelessness they create in the lives of the women they deal with. And you know, my job is made so much easier when other agencies put their hands up and say, we need to get better at what we're doing. Let me give you one final story. I met a woman several years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago. She was 19 and she had been forced into marriage at the age of 16. She'd come out, but she wore her wedding ring not on her wedding finger, but on the exact opposite finger. And I said to her, why are you wearing your wedding ring on the wrong finger? And she said, because they forced me to marry the wrong man. And like you, I chuckled. And then I thought, hang on a minute. She's now got a lifetime of despair, of rape, and everything else that flows from that. That is her protest, because she doesn't have a voice. Therefore, it's my duty and yours to be her voice. Thank you.